Okay. Thank you, Imran.
Yeah.
And my greetings to all of you. I'm not going to say good morning or good evening because you're all in different time zones. And my greetings to you from Los Angeles, wherever you may be. So, Imran has given a very, very brief introduction to multiversity. I want to add a few words about multiversity before I uh, speak to you about what's weighing on my mind at the present moment. So, Multiversity was an initiative that was commenced by Claude Alvarez, who lives in Goa. For those of you who are in India, especially, you would have some familiarity with him, I think. He's been a major activist and a public intellectual as well. Um, and this initiative was started by him and Ashish Nandi, who is, a major public intellectual in India, author of 3 dozen books, and one of the most important critical theorists of our times anywhere in the world. And the other person who was involved in it was Muhammad Idris, um, whom we all dearly loved. He passed away a few years ago, and he was the one who backed this enterprise and who partly funded it and arranged for the meetings in Penang. And his memory is still fresh in my mind in every way. And I was part of the original group as well. And we met every year for about 10 years and then really dispersed. And what was Multiversity about? Multiversity was an initiative intended to make us think about how the West had colonized our minds, that it hadn't simply colonized countries and territories, that the categories through which we think about the world, through which we apprehend reality, very often through which we imagine the world, that these categories were really bequeathed to us by the West. So we wanted to be reflective and self reflective about this enterprise. And we also wanted to think about the possibilities of the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of the university. Um, like many such enterprises, the ambitions were big. We found that there were lots of obstacles on the way. And we did have a few initiatives which persisted for some time. And one of them was a pamphlet series that I initiated called Dissenting Knowledges Pamphlet Series. I commissioned 15 pamphlets by really leading writers around the world working in very different registers than what you find in the formal university, particularly the university in the West. And at this particular juncture, then it was decided that we need to maybe revive it. And Imran took the initiative there, and he approached me and asked me to deliver what eventually I decided would be a two-part lecture. So this is the first of two parts. The second part will be 5, 6 weeks from now. And I should mention at the outset that those of you who are so there's a Imran
Echo coming.
hello, Imran, can you hear the echo? Okay, I think it's gone now. So this that for the second meeting, which will be about 5, 6 weeks from now, that will be focused really essentially on the politics of knowledge systems. And part of that work is the kind of work
The
that I've
kind of
been doing
work that I've been doing
for
for,
two, three
2, 3
decades.
decades.
And this particular first part here is not really on the knowledge systems. Uh, what it is, as the title indicates, is thinking about the world from this particular moment. All right. And so I've actually given a title to my remarks and called it The Conjuncture of the Present: Challenges for the Future of Humankind and Planetary Existence. So in May 1941, on his 80th birthday and just a few months before he passed, Rabindranath Tagore wrote an essay called Shabyatar Sankat, which is translated into English as Crisis in Civilization. Now, he details in this essay the contours of British rule in India and also ventures forth with some comments about his friendships with some Englishmen, particularly those Englishmen and some Englishwomen who were supporters of India's independence. Um, and he describes in this brief essay his disillusionment with the West. He says that were it not for Englishmen such as C.F. Andrews, that's Charlie Andrews, he says, my despair, and I quote, at the prospect of Western civilization would be unrelieved. In the meanwhile, the demon of barbarity has given up all pretense and has emerged with unconcealed fangs, ready to tear up humanity in an orgy of devastation. From one end of the world to the other, the poisonous fumes of hatred darken the atmosphere. The spirit of violence, which perhaps lay dormant in the psychology of the West, has at last roused itself and desecrates the spirit of man. And you have to recall, of course, that he's writing in 1941. This is in the midst of World War II. But then he goes on to say that, but today, when I'm about to quit the world, that faith has gone bankrupt altogether. Because he says that he thought that the springs of civilization would continue to issue out of the heart of Europe, but now it seems that the world has gone bankrupt. My faith has gone bankrupt almost. As I look around, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility, and yet I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in man. End quote. And that is, of course, partly what inspires this talk as well. Now, a year before that, Walter Benjamin, some of you will know him as a German philosopher uh, associated with the Frankfurt School, who committed suicide at the French-Spanish border in 1940, when it became clear to him that as a Jew, he was unlikely to escape from the clutches of the Germans as they advanced. In 1940, Benjamin famously expressed his reticence about using the word crisis. Remember that essay by Rabindranath Tagore translates into English as the crisis of civilization, right? So Benjamin expresses his reticence about using the word crisis to express the fiendishly perilous times in which he and many others were living, if only because to him, the thinking person is always in a state of crisis. When has the world not seemed unjust to many people, and when has violence not displayed its ravenous maw? When has the world, or at least some part of it, not seemed to be on fire? To a thinking person, the question can never be why we are in a crisis, but why we are not, I would say. Why we are not, considering the nature of the world at any point in time. That is to say, if you're committed to some unimpeachable notion of human dignity, to some idea of distributive justice, and to some notion of equality, if not of equity, then it is impossible to fathom a time when humankind was not in a state of crisis. It is not surprising that every generation to think of its own woes, of its own sorrows, as particularly onerous. And if I may paraphrase Charles Dickens, not many have thought in their own lifetime that it was the best of times, but many have surely thought it was the worst of times. We are living in strange, dark, perilous times, and thus the set of reflections. I say this with the awareness that every age is prone to think that its own woes are the worst. That is, of course, one reason why every age must have its own poets, prophets, and philosophers. Now, imagine you were living through the Holocaust, or you were living through World War II, or you were living through the partition of India, the Batwara, as it's called in India, right? Or imagine that you were living through the Batwara of Pakistan itself in 1971, the division of Pakistan and the creation of a new state of Bangladesh, which happened concomitantly with a genocide, right? Wouldn't you think, if you think of any of these times or hundreds of others, that you were living in the worst possible times? You would think that your own sorrows were the worst possible sorrows. And imagine that you were living through the killing fields of Gaza, or that you were in Tehran 2 months ago and being bombarded day and night, right? You would have every reason to think that you're living through the worst possible times. Nevertheless, I want to say that our woes, our difficulties, our moral conundrums are our very own. The inescapable fact is that we are living at the intersection or conjuncture of a range of phenomena that makes our times distinct and dangerous and unfathomable. Now, some of these phenomena have been present in the past, if not always in the same form or to the same degree. Some are relatively new to our times, but it is quite certain that they have not been present together to form what I am calling the conjuncture of the present. If, for example, there has always been, stretching back to antiquity, poverty and extreme inequality, such inequality has not been present until around a generation or two ago alongside global warming. The phrase climate refugees would have been foreign to us until relatively recent times. Now, some of these phenomena that I'm going to discuss have, in my view, not been recorded or recognized as such. Some of them are altogether obvious, and for that very reason have escaped our attention. Something may be in front of your nose and it escapes you. This is a variation on what Freud called the psychopathology of everyday life. Some of these phenomena have been normalized and therefore scarcely receive attention. And I would number poverty and inequality among them, except in a calculated sort of way in government reports, in the work of well meaning individuals or some NGOs, and so on. That is to say, we proceed with our lives with only a lingering awareness of inequality and poverty. Some of the phenomena will seem all too apparent, but only after I have enunciated them. Most of them can be encapsulated under a different language, and I would not be averse to articulating my concerns differently if anyone were to offer a more illuminating approach. There is, moreover, no doubt in my mind that the conjuncture of the present may be informed or shaped by other phenomena that have escaped me. What then is the conjuncture of the present? And I'm going to offer that conjuncture of the present in 11 theses. 11 theses. First, much of the democratic world has lurched towards authoritarianism. I don't here want to be detained, incidentally, by the question of whether we were ever democratic at all, right? Whether in India, the United States, Turkey, or elsewhere. I mean, you can read someone like Arundhati Roy, and she would say that democracy was always a farce in India anyhow. We never really had any democracy to begin with. I think that if we take that, she may be right, but I think if you take that line of argumentation, there's really no scope for discussion, it seems to me, right? There is electoral democracy. We know what the enormous shortcomings of electoral democracy are, but we shouldn't undermine the fact that people have used electoral democracy, particularly people who are disadvantaged, to improve their position in life as a constituency, as a group, to make inroads into the public sphere, for example. Okay. So I don't really want to, frankly, be detained by this consideration that we never had any democracy. And I know the same argument can be made apropos the US. I myself have been tempted into making it on more than one occasion, because I'm well aware of the fact that the history of this country originates with genocide, and that what was called the Constitution of the United States became an instrument, a charter of the oppression of Black people, even if it was a source of deliverance for white people. Right? So we can go along that trajectory as well. I'm well aware of that trajectory. Now, if you take the case of the US, the case of the US is even more complicated because I think it's safe to say that nowhere in the world were the First Amendment rights, the rights to freedom of speech and expression, as strong in the US as they, nowhere have they been as strong as they have been in the US, until, of course, very, very recently. But this same US, as we know, and as I've already mentioned, has waged relentless, lethal assaults upon states around the world. The US has bombed more countries than any other nation in the world. Okay? And this would, however, not be the first time, if we left aside that consideration, it would not be the first time that democracy seems imperiled in these countries. India had an emergency when our constitutional rights were suspended in 1975-77, and the US went through the McCarthy period, followed by attempts by the state to repress the civil rights movement. But there is no question in my mind that the US is falling, and rather rapidly, into a state of authoritarianism and possible dictatorship. The other most obvious example of this precipitous decline into authoritarianism, some people call it fascism, is India. Some scholars have called it majoritarianism, which has its own politics. It can be misleading in some ways, because we have to remember that the attack in India has been leveled not only by the Hindu majority against Muslims and Dalits, it's also been leveled against other Hindus who are viewed as being of a secular disposition or being anti-national, and so forth and so on. So it's not only strictly religion based. Okay? And then one can add, of course, to this list of countries that have lurched towards authoritarianism, one can easily add Argentina, Turkey, and of course Israel. And when I'm referring to Israel, I'm referring not only to the fierce repression of the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but, and this is sometimes forgotten, to the repression of over 2.1 million Palestinian Arabs, okay, who are mostly Muslims, although there are about 8 to 9% of Christians and 8 to 9% of Druze. There is also a very significant and by all means growing lurch towards right-wing nationalism in Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, France, Japan, and Germany. I am also aware that some people might point to an opposite tendency. Very recently, in the last few days, Viktor Orban has just been dealt a decisive defeat in Hungary. And Brazil saw not so long ago the return of Lulu and the defeat of Bolsonaro. So therefore, if someone were inclined to argue that the pendulum can move, and over time has done so many times, as much from the right to the left as it has from the left to the right, I would affirm that the argument is not without some merit. But this is not a matter of weighing the pros and cons of my proposition, right? The indubitable fact is that we are witnessing the collapse and capitulation of institutions on a large scale in established democracies, and the capture of state institutions, as in India and the US, by those who have openly displayed xenophobic sentiments or increasing support for xenophobic and militantly nationalistic elements in other democracies such as Japan and Germany. And in that sense, I think this lurch towards authoritarianism that I'm describing on this scale is, I think, a relatively new phenomenon. The second thesis, the second phenomenon, global warming is real. We should speak, of course, more broadly of climate change. This is not a point on which I'm going to elaborate at great length. Each of these 11 theses, we can speak about them for a couple of hours easily. This one, I think, is going to be self-evident to most people. I'm just going to give some rudimentary insight into it. Um, but as I said, I'm not going to develop the argument at considerable length here. And this will be true of a number of other of these theses or phenomena that I'm going to describe. The UN World Meteorological Organization 2024-26 reports warn of a red alert for the planet as greenhouse gases drive record-breaking heat, ocean warming, and rapidly melting ice. The decade from 2015 to 2024 is the warmest on record, with global warming set to breach the critical 1.5 Celsius threshold, leading to irreversible and cascading climate tipping points. The Earth's climate is more out of balance, it's out of whack, than at any other time in observed history, that is, in the last 65 years, because these greenhouse gas concentrations continue to drive warming of the atmosphere and the ocean and the melting of ice. So the World Meteorological Organization's State of the Global Climate Report of 2025 confirms that 2015 to 2025 are the hottest 11 years on record. The hottest 11 years, 2015 to 2025 on record. And that 2025 was the second or third hottest year on record at about 1.43 degrees Celsius above the 1850-1900 average. We all have heard of and are familiar with extreme climate events as they're described, which include intense heat, extremely heavy and unusual rainfall, tropical cyclones, and all of these we know have caused considerable devastation. Okay. The ocean continues to warm and absorb carbon dioxide. It has been absorbing the equivalent of about 18 times the annual human energy use each year for the past 2 decades. Right? So one could go on in this particular vein. We commonly think of global warming in terms that I've described thus far. That is, we think of extreme climate events. And wherever you are in the world, if you're in Australia, you would be well familiar with the extraordinary fires of the last several years. I'm in California at the moment, and Los Angeles had an extremely dangerous situation early last year. All right. But consider this, even a 1% increase, let's move to a slightly different tangent of this point. Even a 1% increase in the temperature of the Earth's surface means a considerable increase in dengue and other mosquito-borne diseases. Or consider that global warming has a direct correspondence to increased consumption. Now, today, if I had to define Homo sapiens, I would say that the human being is Homo consumptio. That's a Latin for consumption, consumptio. Okay, that's a Latin root of the word, consumption, which, though I've never seen discussed anywhere, means to use up, to eat, to waste. And some of you will surely be familiar with the fact that until the late 19th century, at least, tuberculosis was referred to as consumption. That's what the Romantic poets, some of the English Romantic poets, died of at a very early age. Keats, of consumption. It was called consumption. The disease used you up. It used up the human body. It left the person wasted. And that's why the word consumption today means to use up, to waste. Think of it, right? I mean, that's not the meaning that is commonly ascribed to it. Because for man truly eats up the earth's resources, man is a wasteful creature, uniquely so. This modern economy is all geared up towards increasing growth and therefore increasing consumption. Now, the formula of consumption has been advanced as a means for leveling That is, as consumption grows in countries which are still developing, and we see an increase in the growth of middle class, it will be impossible to say that those countries are catching up to the developed world. But is this the only way of leveling? Right? And what comes to my mind, of course, is an observation that Gandhi made back in 1931 when he'd gone to England for the Round Table Conference. And he said, if a small island country such as England has had to colonize 25% of the world's population, of the world's resources, so to speak, okay? You colonize a people, you colonize their resources. If a small island country has had to do that to give its own people the standard of living they now enjoy, he says, imagine what India would have to do or China would have to do to give all of its people the same standard of living. It would strip the world bare, just as locusts do, he said. Right? So, is this the only way of leveling that we can think of to increase consumption? And this is where, of course, Gayatri Spivak's famous phrase comes to mind because she said that the privileged will have to unlearn some of their privileges. Some people will have to obviously lower their lifestyles. A considerable number of people will have to possibly lower their lifestyles. And I think we should always, whenever we make arguments of this kind, also anticipate the rejoinder. I know that one rejoinder will be that, yes, but the world is now slowly gravitating towards green energies, and there is going to be the diminishment of the use of fossil fuels, and that will resolve our problems. But this argument is really an argument out of the playbook of technicism, the supposition that whatever problems technology has created, and technology has a great deal to do with our increased levels of consumption too, right? But technology is also being used metaphorically here, that whatever problems it has created, it can also resolve, right? So you never have to leave that framework altogether, right? And I think I'm saying to you that this is part of the story of global warming. It's not simply a story of extreme climate events and all of that. We're going to have to think about the much wider implications of what is entailed in this. Um, the previous Pope, by the way, Pope Francis, had some intimation of this because in 2015 he had issued an encyclical, which is really quite a remarkable encyclical called Laudato Si, Praise be to you. And the subject of that was what he called the care of our common home. The story of global warming, I want to suggest to you, can be translated, the perils of that, into the question of the care of our common home. Third, there is insurmountable evidence of growing inequality within every nation and to some degree between nations. This phenomenon is not new, of course, to our times. I'm also aware that extreme poverty in some middle income countries has sharply declined. So here again, I want to anticipate the other side's objections beforehand. China is the best example, of course, because even from the uncertain data that comes from that country, it is very clear that there has been a decline, a sharp decline in extreme poverty. India and Brazil are other examples, though to a much lesser degree. Around the world, those living on less than $2.15 a day, this is a measure taken by international organizations, not by me, because of course you could ask yourself who can live on $2.15 a day, even in poor countries. But those who lived on less on $2.15 a day declined 40% from 2010 to 2019 to around 700 million. Right? Okay, so there's no question that there has been a decline there, and therefore the question would be, how do we square that with the proposition that I began with, that there's insurmountable evidence of growing inequality within every nation and to some degree between nations, right? So let me take here the instance of the United States. If you look at I could have shared some slides with you, but I want and I'll be happy to send them to Imran, the links, and you can look at the slides there. In the United States, there was a relatively equal distribution of wealth from the 1940s to the 1970s. That the differences were not as sharp as they would become beginning around 1980. And of course, they have sharpened to the orders of magnitude that we can't even think of really today. All right. So this widening of disparities in income and wealth started in the early 1980s and has become much greater than it ever was in the past. Around the mid 1980s, the top quintile, and think about why the early and mid 1980s. So there are a number of things going on around the early and mid 1980s. It's the beginning of what you can call manufacturing globalization. Okay. I say manufacturing globalization because there are lots of arguments by scholars that globalization existed before too. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was perhaps a very good illustration of that. But we're talking about manufacturing globalization, okay, and we're talking about the kind of supply chain which have now become critical part of the story of globalization, right? That's manufacturing globalization. Early 1980s is when it started really, okay? The rise of microcomputers and of course the rise of the right in the US and of right-wing economics as policy, okay, represented by people like Ronald Reagan, right? So this widening of disparities, which you can chart very clearly, begins in income and wealth, began in the early 1980s and has become much greater than it ever was in the past. Around the mid 1980s, a top quintile, that is the top 20%, began to pull away from the bottom 80%. And similarly, the top 5% began to pull away from those below the 95 percentile. That is widening the chasm or gap in the ranks of the well to do. Okay, within that 20 percentile as well, you begin to now see a much wider chasm. Around 2018, the top 0.01% began to pull away dramatically so from the rest of the 99 percentile, indeed, from the rest of the 99.99 percentile of the US population. And the US Congressional Budget Office released this remarkable chart which shows this very clearly. What this graph shows you is that within the top 1% of the American income distribution, the top 1/10 of 1% were pulling away from the rest of the top 1%, and the top 100th of the 1% were pulling dramatically away from the rest of the top 1/10 of 1%. Okay? That's what's really extraordinary. And you begin to see this in a great many countries. I mean, that's the interesting phenomenon. You begin to see it, for example, in India as well, where all the indices show that the accumulation of wealth by the top 20, the top 50 is on a scale which we cannot really conceive of. Okay. And of course, in the United States, we know that if the projections hold true, we're talking about the first trillionaires, somewhere along the road in the next 5 to 10 years. So, how does the picture look globally? Global inequality is rising rapidly, with the world's top 1% owning 47.5% of the global wealth, holding roughly $214 trillion. The top 0.001% possess 3 times more wealth than the bottom 50%. And this massive concentration, which is driven by corporate stock ownership, by technological shifts, all of that is accelerating. Okay. And we know, and the one NGO which is largely devoted really to a study of international poverty and global poverty and all of that is Oxfam. And Oxfam has released a huge number of reports at very short intervals to show what the differences are. That working families in most countries are now facing substantial existential crises, subsistence crises as well. All right. Okay. So I think you get the point. We could go on in this vein, I think, for a considerable period of time. That inequality has been there before. There's no question about it. But what we're speaking about is orders of magnitude of the kind that we have never really seen globally before. And remember, once again, I'm gonna mention this a number of times. It's the conjuncture. As I pointed out, there might have been things present singly at this moment, because this is what it really is. It's a kind of a reflection about where are we and what is it that makes our times so extraordinarily perilous. Fourth, technology has introduced a gap that we are not in the position of comprehending. What sort of gap am I referring to? On the one hand, the pace of technological change is astounding. On the other hand, our moral vocabulary has not grown an iota. Indeed, it has shrunk, a point that I'm going to make separately as well. Now, in Hind Swaraj, a small tract that Gandhi published in 1909, he wrote this. I mean, I had to read this. This is a book that I've taught for 4 decades, and I've read it 50 times maybe. I teach it once a year. And this passage that I'm going to quote to you, I mean, it looks like it could have been written today because of the particular way in which it is totally prescient, right? And which it anticipates some things. So he says, and I quote, formerly men traveled in wagons. Now they fly through the air in trains at the rate of 400 and more miles per day. He's mixing its metaphors. The railways fly because man flies, so to speak. But of course, at that point in 1909, there was no commercial aviation at that point. This is considered the height of civilization. I'm quoting Gandhi. It has been stated as men progress that they shall be able to travel in airship and reach any part of the world in a few hours. Men will not need the use of their hands and feet. They will press a button and they will have clothing by their side. So just go to Amazon, press the button, click, and order. And you have clothing by your side. They will press another and they will have their newspapers. Right? So whether you read the Indian Express or you read the Star or the New York Times, just go to the app and you have your newspaper. A third, and a motor car will be waiting for them. Your Uber is always there, just a phone call away. This is civilization, right? That's what he says. And this is, of course, what he meant. This is 115 years ago. This is before the advent of the computer, right? Before the advent of AI and all of that. And the question is, if technology has moved at such an extraordinary pace, how do we think about the languages, the moral languages that we have to make available our ideas? Have they changed? Is the change only the change that has been mandated from the top so that we now all celebrate something called diversity after having destroyed it entirely on the ground, which is what the West did, right? It leveled everything on the ground. And now it mandates this diversity from the top, right? This is the extent of our moral language that we have today, right? What such a moral philosophy and moral language might look like, might be necessary for this age, we don't know. Religions brought in moral concepts, generally, interestingly, as negative admonitions, because of course it's easier to agree upon what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't commit adultery, we shouldn't commit murder. It's much easier to agree upon that than it is to agree upon what we should do, right? The positive things that we should do. But after what the religions brought to us, and we've had, of course, moral philosophy in most countries, But it seems to me that our moral thinking is at a total impasse. And that's what I mean by the gap between technology and our moral thinking. Fifth, we have to understand we do not have any control whatsoever over AI. Now, let me say this, that whenever there are technological revolutions, there are anxieties. So I want to be certain that some of you don't simply think that, Mr. Lal is experiencing an anxiety about AI because it's a new kind of technology. Right? I mean, I'm someone who teaches history, but also teaches philosophy and literature, and I'm well aware of the fact that whenever there has been a significant shift, okay, and technological innovations, a technological revolution has been created, whether it was the assembly line, whether it was trains, cars, aeroplanes, telephones, um, things that put information at our fingertips and all of that, we had anxieties. Of course, I think that one difference with AI, notable difference, is that the unprecedented speed at which technology is advancing. I mean, 10 years ago, barely anybody was even talking about AI. We have at UCLA where I'm teaching, I can't diverge for reasons of confidentiality, but we have a case going on where, which has to do with recordings in a classroom and the use of AI. And 4 years ago, the university didn't even have a set of regulations, you know, um, because nobody really had to give any thought to it, right? So humans have endured a tussle, a competition with machines for several hundred years. And one of the consequences was that people were displaced, people lost jobs. And that's a legitimate concern, but that's not really what I'm speaking about. That's not my fundamental concern. I'm not trying to undermine that concern that people get displaced, right? I mean, so but whenever you have a technological revolution, you're going to find that people are going to lose their jobs, they're going to be displaced. Of course, people will also find new jobs owing to some technologies. That also happens. But let's not forget that in the early part of the 19th century, the vast population of every country was made up of farmers. And today, the percentage of people who make their living as farmers, especially in the developed world, as it's called, or the highly industrialized world, the percentage of people who make their living from farming is generally 1.5% to 4%. That's all, right? And so countries were nations of farmers and they're no longer nations of farmers, right? So we have to understand that there's always been this tussle, and that's where, of course, the Luddites were one reaction to it. So the Luddites were this English group of textile workers who, between 1811 and 1816, launched a protest against the Industrial Revolution by destroying machinery, especially mechanized looms, right? Automation leads to job loss, workers are replaced, but automation may, once again, I repeat myself, create new jobs. All right. What then is the fundamental problem that I'm really alluding to when I speak about the fact that we don't at all understand AI, okay, and have absolutely no control over it? Now, before I describe that, let me just take your mind for a moment to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. See, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, each of them killed fewer people than the fire bombing of Tokyo over a period of 30 hours in World War II. Some of you are aware of the fact that the Americans firebombed virtually every Japanese city. They left a few targets out of their firing. And I won't get into that, including Kyoto, including Hiroshima. Okay. But cities like Osaka, Nagoya, and many others were virtually obliterated. Virtually obliterated. Now, who has heard of any of that? Unless you're a historian of Japan or a history of World War II or military history, everybody's heard of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the reason for that, even though those bombings killed fewer people than the firebombing, is because a different threshold was crossed. You see, when man assumes the place of God, which is what happened in Hiroshima, that that in a sense you begin to think that you are God. It's in your power to destroy and take life at an instant. It's almost magical. It's sublime. See, there's a different kind of threshold, it's a different kind of obscenity. Now, I want to suggest to you that AI is, in that sense, not simply another technological revolution. It's simply not the same kind of leap that was represented by the telephone, enormous as that was, by the television, enormous as that was, even by the computer and by the internet age. It's a different leap into the future. So here's the question that I would ask, right? Could AI lead to nuclear apocalypse? And it's very interesting that ICANN is the International Commission to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which as an organization was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for whatever it's worth in 2017, says this, and I quote, for AI specifically, the increased application of advanced machine learning in defense systems can speed up warfare, giving decision makers even less time to consider whether or not to launch nuclear weapons, something already measured in minutes, as illustrated in the video below. And then they have a video on that website. Integrating AI into military systems also introduces a potential for unintended consequences because we do not yet fully understand how these complex tools will behave in a crisis. Even if a country does not intend to start a nuclear war, an AI system might misinterpret a situation and respond too aggressively, leading to an accidental flash escalation. The use of AI in satellite and other intelligence detection systems will also make it more difficult to keep historically concealed nuclear weapons, etc., hidden, right? Alternatively, the ability to spoof these systems is unknown and can have terrifying consequences, right? End quote. And so this is what I'm gesturing at, that it's a mistake in my view to simply think of AI as yet another kind of technological revolution, which began, let's say with the Industrial Revolution, or if you want to really look at the modern age, began with something like the computer and the internet age, and then you say, well, this is just the logical progression. No, what we're really speaking about something like the atomic bomb. Okay. We're speaking about territory that, in that sense, is totally uncharted. Sixth, the figure of the migrant, and I'm going to speed up. I'm going to cut short some of the points in the interest of leaving enough time for discussion. The figure of the migrant has become all important. Migrants have always been there in history, in society. And of course, I'm aware of the distinction between migrants, refugees, exiles, and so on. I'm just placing all of them under the figure of the migrant. The migrant, as never before, has become the site for the profound anxieties of every society. You've all heard about what's been happening in countries such as the United States. The xenophobic anti-immigrant fervor that now characterizes the U.S. Some of you would have heard, fewer of you would have heard of what's happening in Sweden. Sweden is cracking at the seams. It has a right center coalition government backed up by a right wing and nationalistic Swedish Democratic Party. Their hostility to migrants is palpable, absolutely palpable. It's not an accident that virtually all the migrants coming to Sweden, the vast majority of them are Muslims coming from Syria, from Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan. Okay? And you have to read about how Sweden is tightening, right, the regulations for their entry. And of course, we know what's been happening in India, right? We know the anti-Muslim sentiment. We know what happened with the Citizenship Amendment Act and all of that. The UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, has said that more people are forcibly displaced from their home today than at any other time in recorded history. Today, the number of people who are forcibly displaced from their home and who are migrants is around 244 million globally. Okay? I mean, nothing can really prepare you until you read it for, prepare to receive a number like this. How do we think about these figures? I wish to frame my remarks around the figure of the migrant and what the figure of the migrant tells us about ourselves, about the knotty problems of citizenship and the nation state and the condition of humankind in these perilous times. Because the figure of the migrant uniquely allows you to enter into the soul of the modern condition and rethink a set of crucial ideas, including citizenship, belonging, the nation state, and hospitality. Right? The migrant allows us to pivot to a vision of the world that is divided between those who move and the unmoved. Right? And this oscillation has never been so important and so critical in thinking of the crossroads at which we stand today. Okay? Because the migrant also makes us rethink who are the subjects of history, right? Who makes history? And of course, you know that this has been at the heart of many of the debates in the profession of history. And one of the ways in which the profession has dealt with it has it has had an additive approach. By additive, I mean that the subjects of history were white males. Well, then you add white females, and you add black males, and you add black females, and then you add, Asian males and Asian females, and then you add, Asian gays and Asian lesbians and black lesbians and black gays and etc. etc. These so that's additive. Various people who were never the subjects, they start to slowly become subjects. I am looking at it from a very different way here. I am suggesting the subjects of history are those who, for whatever reason, have moved. The ones who move become the subjects and agents of history. And history has little room for those who are unmoved. And of course, some of you will have survived that the word moved and unmoved have many other registers as well, such as when we say that we are moved by such and such thing. It's not accidental that that word move actually moves in so many different kinds of registers, right? But if I had to put it in tangible terms for you, in case you're thinking that this is still a bit of an abstraction, see, think about Europe. To whom does Europe belong now? You only have to go to any major European city, you know, Paris, London, Berlin, Prague, any number of cities, Brussels. I first went to Brussels when I was, I think, 22 years old. Predominantly white city. I went there 5 years ago. And there's entire streets of Vietnamese restaurants. The nature of Europe has changed. And the question really is, to whom does Europe belong? And what do we mean by home? Now, I think these questions have opened themselves up at this juncture in a much more dramatic way, precisely because the figure of the migrant in so many societies has become a figure of xenophobic concern. And it's precisely because the migrant can then say to the European that Europe is not what you think it is, that Europe doesn't belong just to you, you see, right? And this is a very different situation than we ever have had in the past, where the migrant is going into the heart of the West and is fundamentally introducing a kind of an anxiety that the West doesn't have the language to grapple with. Seventh phenomena or thesis: the nation state form is exhausted. And I say this with the full awareness, of course, that the nation state is the only game in town. Right? So there's a contradiction, you might say, that I'm saying that it's exhausted and yet it's the only game in town. What do I mean when I say it's the only game in town? What do the Kurds want? The Kurds want a nation state. What do the Palestinians want? They want a nation state. What do the Basque want? They want a nation state. What do the people in the Chittagong Hill tracts in Bangladesh want? They want a nation state. But the nation state is an exhausted form. Now, the nation state is, in fact, actually relatively new to history. Right? It came about in the wake of what is called the Peace of Westphalia, which brought an end to the 30 Years' War that was fought in Europe between 1618 and 1648. I won't go over the history of that, of course. Okay. But the nation state system was born with that Treaty of Westphalia, and it was consolidated with the French Revolution. And my late colleague, Eugene Weber, wrote an extraordinary work called Peasants into Frenchmen. See, even in the early part of the 19th century, good portions of what are today called France were not French speaking. What he shows in this book is how people were turned into Frenchmen. And what he says, it was a bloody thing. A nation state is always, regretfully, a bloody thing. It's a very nasty piece of work, and it is always assumes its form after inducing a bloodbath and inducing homogenization. That homogenization begins with borders and then begins with the national anthem. Why does every nation state have a national anthem? With a national flag, with national father figures. They're usually father figures, and a few rare occasions there may be mother figures. They're founding fathers, right? And it begins with the regime of the textbook. With the regime of the textbook. So the nation state is inescapably tethered to violence because what it has to do is it has to create a form of homogenization. And that homogenization is not simply a matter of marking inclusion, it's a way of actually marking exclusion, who is not a part of the nation state. And this is what links up with the previous point that I had made, okay, when I was talking about the figure of the migrant, because that figure of the migrant, as I've already suggested, creates enormous anxieties about the nation state. All right. Um, the eighth phenomenon, so there are four more left, and I'll take about 3 to 4 minutes for each and then wind up over there. And I'll have to truncate my remarks when I'm willing to entertain, obviously, questions about any of these. The entire framework of international law has collapsed. It will have to be entirely revisited. In the West, all of this, whenever you read discussions of the rule of law and the rule of the jungle. The classic text in the West is the Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and that portion of it, which is called the Melian Dialogue. So this was a war that took place in what is now called Greece, um, uh, and this was a war between Athens and Sparta. And much like in India, when you had, everybody had to side with either the Pandavas or with the Kauravas in the Mahabharata. So in the Greek world, the expectation was that you either joined the Athenians or you joined the Spartans. So Milos was a small island. It was in Sparta's territory, but it was neutral. And the Athenians land up there and demand tribute. And the Athenians, of course, have fleets of ship and they're far more powerful. And the Melians say we want to maintain our neutrality. And then a dialogue ensues between the Melians and the Athenians. And the Athenians say to the Melians, you know as well as we do that right, as the word goes, is only in question between equals in power. While the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Okay? And then again, further down in that dialogue, our opinion of the gods and our knowledge of men lead us to conclude that it is a general and necessary law of nature to rule wherever one has the power. Right? So the shorthand expression for this is the law of the jungle. And therefore, some of you might say, well, if it's always been the law of the jungle, then why am I speaking about the entire framework of international law? And to make my argument very crisp and short, I want to suggest to you that it's not the case that there never was any rule of law before. Right? I mean, even those like myself who are well aware of the history of imperialism and have focused on that for in a good part of their work, they were always two complementary orders. Complementary. So one was the international base rules order, but that was not for the US. That was for the rest. It was for the weak states. But that it worked for them sometimes because the countries that were powerful never really subscribed to that rules based order. They did as they pleased, the US being the classic example of that. All right. Okay. Classic example of that. Right? But what I'm saying is that now we are at this juncture where even that complementariness is no longer there. You see? And in that sense, we do have to think about. So, for example, the United Nations. Where has the United Nations been in the conflict that is taking place right now? In the war of aggression over Iran launched by Israel and the United States. Where really was the United Nations when Israel just rode roughshod over the Palestinians and committed a genocide? Because it's doing essentially what the League of Nations did 100 years ago, passing resolutions. That signifies that there is a complete collapse of what is sometimes called the rules based order. I think that we're going to have to seriously revisit what can be done about that. Ninth, the second half of the 20th century is best captured through one word. That word is decolonization. In my next lecture, I will speak about the decolonization of knowledge systems. Right? But here I'm speaking tangibly also of decolonization. The US, of course, didn't see it that way because the US saw the second half of the 20th century as the period of the Cold War. That's the operative term in the American imagination. If you were living in the global South, the operative term was decolonization. That is the fundamental phenomenon in the second half of the 20th century. And now, my ninth proposition or phenomena that I'm describing to you is very simply this, namely, that I think the global South, which was the force, in a sense, that animated this idea of decolonization, I think that consensus is finished. In other words, anti colonialism was there and it helped to build up the idea of the global south. I'm afraid, unfortunately, the idea of anti colonialism is no longer part of the vocabulary of our imagination today. And someone might say, well, isn't Iran really demonstrating something of anti colonialism in its resolute defense against Israel and the United States? Well, yes. I mean, I think that one can say that, yes, Iran has been a force, it's been a surprising force, and it has offered. And if for those of you know that Iran has put out these animated videos of with Lego characters, it's actually quite remarkable, and they're actually invoking the whole history, many of them, of anti-colonialism. They go and and the history of the history of U.S. Imperialism and all of that. Okay, but I don't think that that is a very good example for a number of ways, because we have to remember that anti colonialism was also a question of self determination. Iran's sovereignty has been assured for many years. It's a different matter that Israel and the United States are now, bombing the country, and that Israel would obviously like to see Israel splintered. It would like to balkanize Iran. I don't think there's any question in my mind that that's what Israel would like to do. It would like to splinter Iran. And this way, Israel can become the uncontested hegemon of the entire area, right? But nevertheless, the movement there has not been animated by what historically we know as self-determination, and this is apart from the consideration that there is enormous dissent within Iran. Okay, a huge number of Iranians will not agree that what Iran is really doing is simply a demonstration of what we might call anti-colonialism. But even if it was, right? I mean, if somebody was persistent in the argument and could persuade me, I'm suggesting to you that anti-colonialism as an ideology has had its day. It's a subject of study now, but I don't think it is an animating force in politics anyway. And that brings me to my last two phenomena, which are the most complex in some ways. There has been, my 10th proposition, an extraordinary and unprecedented debasement of language in modern times. This means a number of things. And the thing that it means most evidently, I have 2 pages on that. I'm going to cut short all of that. What it means to most people is very simply the increase in hate speech. And I don't want to minimize that factor. I know of the increase of hate speech in a large number of countries. And I agree entirely that it's a pressing problem. And I agree entirely that it has fostered, for example, Islamophobia. In the United States, for example, it wasn't only Islamophobia. Hate speech against Asians increased dramatically in the first 3 months after COVID. Enormously. I hold a faculty appointment in Asian American Studies at UCLA as well. And the Asian American Studies Center issued report after report showing the massive increase in hate speech against Asians. Because remember that Trump had called it the China virus and all of that as well. All right. So it's not only a question of hate speech being directed against Muslims, although that's certainly the most prominent part of that story. What I am speaking about is something actually really quite different. Let me read out to you a passage. And this is a passage from a very famous essay. Political language, I'm quoting, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, is designed to make lies sound truthful. and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. End quote. What a beautiful sentence. And where is the sentence from? It's from an essay written by George Orwell in the aftermath of the Second World War in 1946, to be precise, in April 1946. The essay is called Politics and the English Language. One of the most remarkable examples he gave of the debasement of the English language was the word pacification. The word pacification is from pax, which means peace. And some of you know, of course, that babies are given pacifiers. So when a baby is colic or it's crying too much, and what do? You push the pacifier, basically a nipple, right, into its mouth. But how was that word used at that time? When the British would bomb a Masood village from the air, they said, "We're pacifying the village." Was pacification. Okay? And that's what Orwell called debasement. He gave many other examples of this. Now, I want to push, so we're not talking just about hate speech now. I hope you all understand, right? Because hate speech is directed at a particular group for because of some characteristics it has. The religion it pursues, its views on sexuality, its politics, its ideology, etc. It's directed at particular individuals and particular groups. The debasement of language is universal. And there's a kind of debasement that nobody even thinks about when somebody says, "Oh, this is it's not rocket science." That's actually debasement because that's a totally worthless, useless metaphor, frankly. As though there was something really great about rocket science to begin with, right? And of course, a moral discussion would be far more subtle and far more complex to unravel than something called rocket science. But notice how we just use that phrase. It's not rocket science, or it's a no-brainer, right? People will use these expressions. It's not simply a matter of expressions and colloquialisms. It's not simply a matter of bad metaphors, of lies masquerading as truths, of extreme carelessness with language, which Gandhi incidentally said was a form of violence, and even the disdain for violence. The problem is that there are now words and concepts that are no longer available to us because of this debasement of language as well. The best illustration of that is the word shame. You see, you cannot. 50 years ago, you could get a politician to step down and to disappear because of something that is revealed, and then the person feels shame. I regret to say the word shame is almost an obsolete word in the English language today. People have no shame anymore, generally speaking. It's completely irrelevant if somebody said to me that they feel shameful or that they feel shame. The question is not whether an individual feels it or not, here or there. I'm saying as an operative concept in the English language, it is no longer fundamentally available to us. Much like the word reverence, because reverence is almost automatically associated with things like superstition. Oh, the person has reverence, a blind faith. The word reverence is a very rich word in the English language. All right. So that's what I'm referring to is something far more complex than simply something called hate speech, for example, or even the use of bad language. And finally, that brings me to one of the most complex phenomena of our time, namely our inability to live and thrive with ambiguity. Ambiguity. Right? This completes what I call the conjuncture. Now, what do I mean by ambiguity here? What struck me after the September 11th bombings was the constant refrain I heard from every politician in the US, and which we are now hearing again in the US, and we're hearing it in India. Either you're with us or you're against us. Okay? And it meant if you're not with us, that means you're with bin Laden. In India, it means if you're not with us, then it means you're with the Muslim. Right? Now, by ambiguity, I mean more than just uncertainty. It is also more than ambivalence. It is a space of in betweenness. It is a space of liminality. It is a space of liminality, right? The space of in betweenness. And this space of liminality is best captured usually through mythos. I use the word mythos, not the word myth, because myth, again, is one of those words which has been totally debased. Today, when you say, people will say, oh, that's a myth, meaning it's a falsehood, it's a lie. But the word myth is from the Greek mythos, which is a complex system of beliefs, symbols. It's a way of imagining a world, right? Because the Greek meaning of the word is story or plot, describing an interconnected body of tales, not a single story. The mythos sets up a narrative framework. And what do I mean by liminality? Okay, I had two examples here, but I'll give you only one and I'll end with that so that there's now time for discussion. What is my story of liminality? So if you go to the mythos of the Indian world, there is a myth of Narasimha. Narasimha is one of the incarnations of the god Vishnu. He's half man, half lion. Half man, half lion. And what is the myth about? So the myth is that there was a person, his name was Prahlad, and he was a devotee of Vishnu, the god Vishnu. His father, Hiranyakashipu, is a devotee of Shiva. His father wants his son. I'm giving the shorthand form, okay? He basically wants his son to convert. And he subjects his son to all kinds of trials and tribulations, tortures him, all of that. The son is a steadfast devotee of Vishnu. Steadfast devotee of Vishnu. So finally, Prahlad, though, gets, Vishnu also sees the plight of Prahlad, and then Prahlad goes to Vishnu, and Vishnu says, I will help you. I will come down as an avatar, as an incarnation. Why does he come down as a half man, half lion? You see, it's that in betweenness, because Prahlad's father, Hiranyakashipu, has been given a boon. Because he is such a great devotee of Shiva, Shiva has given him protection. Shiva says you cannot be killed either at night or during the day. You cannot be killed on land and you cannot be killed in the air. And you cannot be killed by a human and cannot be killed by a beast. Now he thinks he's covered everything. So Vishnu comes down as Narasimha, half man, half lion. So it's not a full man, it's not a full beast. He strikes exactly at the hour of dusk, when it's neither night nor day. And he comes out of a pillar, not from the air and not from the ground. Right? And then he demolishes the demon, because that's who Hiranyakashipu is. He's a demon. Now that's the myth. That's liminality. It's the state of in-betweenness. This in-betweenness, I'm saying, is ambiguity. And I think we have no longer the tools to live and learn from ambiguity. Right? So this completes my sort of explanation of what I've described as the conjuncture of the present. I've given you 11 theses, and Others may want to add more, or they may be actually subsets of what I'm saying. And of course, each of these points could be elaborated at greater length, but it gives you an idea of where I think we are at present and what is the nature of the peril of our times. And I'm happy to take questions, of course. Thank you.